There we go. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Avoiding Boycotts and Worse, Why Your Company Should Aspire to Be Trusted, Not Just Successful. SVDX is an organization dedicated to education and networking programs for boards of directors. We encourage you to visit our website, www.svdx.org. I do want to send a special thank you to the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University for co-hosting our session today. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers very briefly. Marianne Dewan is County Superintendent of Schools, Santa Clara County Board of Education. Dr. Dewan has over 27 years of experience in education and is recognized for her expertise and experience in early learning, special education, education reform, and change leadership. Jack Lazar is a public and private company CFO, GM, and corporate development executive. Mr. Lazar is currently an independent board member at Silicon Labs, Residio, Casper, Box, Threadup, and Tile. He's also an advisory board member for Santa Clara University's Account and Finance Advisory Boards. Deepa Seetharaman is a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. Ms. Seetharaman covers Facebook, LinkedIn, and other technology companies for WSJD, the Wall Street Journal's Global Technology Bureau. Ann Skeet is the Senior Director, Leadership Ethics, Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. Ann researches, writes, and speaks about the ethical dilemmas of leaders, corporate culture, and the ethical challenges of governance. Ann was previously CEO of American Leadership Forum Silicon Valley and VP of Marketing with Knight Ridder. Our moderator today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO, founder, and entrepreneur. He's currently chairman of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, chairman of SVDX, and a fellow at Stanford University. Today's program will be 60 minutes in length. I do encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will be recording today's session for future viewing on our website. And with that, I will hand it over to Dan.
Great, thank you, Nancy. This is a really exciting session. It's a tough topic in some ways because it's so broad, but we have the perfect panel. We always have great panels, but it's very hard to get just the right cross-section. And today we really do have just the right cross-section. We have an active public servant in a very prominent role. We have someone who's at a center for ethics with a corporate background and lots of involvement in the corporate and business world. We have someone who is a journalist, but not just a journalist with the Wall Street Journal and covering issues that are very much the center of this. And then we have really an outstanding, successful serial entrepreneur who's also a very successful investor and board member of many interesting boards. So it's perfect cross-section. And so the first question, which is unusual, normally people who attend these webinars know that we have conversational style. We keep it pretty casual, and I try not to let us go all in a row talking. But since we are such a great cross-section, I would like everyone to take maybe 1 to 3 minutes at the most, and I'll jump in and cut you off if it goes too long, to answer the first question. And I think, Ann, I'm going to let you start with the first stab at this since you kind of inspired the session. And the question is pretty simple, but let me give a backdrop to it, which is, I think arguably and observably, in the United States and the world, of course, complexity is increasing. Very few of us have the luxury or the opportunity to actually understand everything we rely on every day, to actually understand how everything works and be able to explain it, and certainly not to be there as either the witness to or speak to the firsthand participants in the events and things that we care about and that matter. And so it's a matter of scale, it's a matter of complexity. We actually have to trust a lot. And it feels like every day that goes by, the world becomes, in many positive ways, more complex, and we have to trust even more. And yet, it turns out that data shows that trust in institutions is really declining. So my question for you, for everybody to kick off is, how much do you think, or can you describe for us the scale of the decline in trust in institutions? And maybe give us a sense as to why you think that might be happening. And we're happy to come back to that second part if you want to spend it all in the first part. So, Ann, you get to go first to maybe describe to us the decline in trust in institutions and the scale and how that's manifesting.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. Well, first of all, trust is a common good. So it's something that serves us all. It sort of helps us to be able to interact with different institutions across different sectors. And it's typical for people in leadership positions to put the interests of their own organization first. Many leaders, people that we see in leadership positions, are very good at looking out for their own interests. And maybe they don't spend as much time investing in making the connection for people in their organization to why trust in society is an important common good and something that should also be invested in. So there's that sort of fundamental, it doesn't get the attention that it should. Recently, I think we've seen a lot of contributing factors, and there's plenty of people who track trust. The Edelman Trust Barometer, Axios Harris does polls. All of those suggest that there's sort of two parts to trust. There's competence and ability to do things, to execute well. And then the character piece, the integrity part. It harkens back really to Stephen Covey and 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. In order to trust people, you need both character and competence. And increasingly, people are questioning the character piece, and they're not seeing, I think, both in the choices that institutions are making and companies are making, and in the attributes that leaders are emphasizing. They're losing their confidence in that character piece.
Thank you. That's great. I wonder if, and I'm going. I just noted down a couple follow-up questions, but I want to let everyone weigh in. But I'm going to come back to Anne to press on a couple of those. Marianne, do you mind going next? If maybe give us your sense of that. You sit in a very particular position where I think you have to engender a lot of trust, and it probably some days isn't as easy as it should be.
I think that it is both true that there's less trust and more trust. What I observe is that, we have less trust, and people talk a lot about their inability to trust big systems, concerns about big systems and big corporations, big government. And yet we often also hear about how much they trust their local school or the people they know that might work in a particular company or in a particular industry. And I think as we're wrestling with the notion of trust and how it is for the common good, it is also at the individual level. So the ways in which relationship helps build trust can also then engender more trust in institutions as well as in corporations. But I also think that we're a bit of a victim of how, as a world, as society, due to technology, we both know more and we know a lot less. So we have incredible access to information. We are bombarded with, news releases and, social media posts and the like. And yet much of that is very surface, which then contributes to this idea and this fear around that we actually know less. And so perhaps we're making decisions and judgments and taking action on less information, not more.
That's such a great point. Academics will tell you that when you dive into a new subfield or new area, at first you start feeling really good because you start answering all the questions that you had in your head. But you started to really make progress when what starts happening is you have more questions than you started with, right? And so there's this interesting phase. And it's such a good point. It's not like we as a society don't want to dive deeper. It's who has time. So we end up with, surface knowledge of a lot of different things. Well, that kind of lends me to switch to DEPA in a way, and not to blame the Wall Street Journal on the surface knowledge, but like that's an interesting place. So a lot of people turn to reputable sources of journalism to learn a little bit about a lot of things, right? And in a way you end up with Marianne's dilemma, but I wonder if you have a particular take on the decline of trust. And I'm going to ask you to at least address a little bit journalism. You're not obligated to, but kind of trust in journalism as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is I guess I'll just acknowledge the critics of journalism, which is to say that there are a lot of places where the media fails, or a lot of places where journalists fail. We don't get the facts right all the time. We lack context some of the time, but when it works well, and it does work well a lot, it holds the power to account. It holds people accountable for the things they say they're going to do. I think part of the problem with societal trust, and trust in these companies, is that a lot of the accountability levers, a lot of the checks and balances have kind of vanished. I mean, if you look at journalism as a whole, there are very well off, or at least comparatively thriving organizations like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, But at the local level, there are a lot of news outlets that have completely been starved of resources. And those are the outlets that people really trust in general, right? They, like to Marianne's point, they tend to trust the local news outlets, their local institutions, and those have been starved of resources. So that has a secondary effect of making it harder to trust local government or local businesses or anything, because you're like, well, who are the people holding them to account? Who are the people that are intervening? It's not just about what a company can do to generate trust. It's also, okay, well, who are the watchdogs that are going to hold that company accountable if they make a mistake? And I think as as time has gone on over the last decade, you've seen a huge loss of journalism, a huge loss in journalism jobs, of money and resources. And I think that that's a big problem. At the same time, I can't blame people for not trusting journalism, because we've been working with fewer and fewer resources. It's going to be inevitable that there are going to be some shortcuts. And I think that that's the tension that my industry really needs to deal with, but also globally. How do people support their local news institutions, and what are the dynamics there? Because that has all these spillover effects into how much we trust larger public institutions.
That's great. I'm going to plant a follow-up question, which I want to come back to because I do want to go to Jack, but
yeah,
maybe you can be thinking about it. And that is, even when institutions or leaders or people make mistakes, it really, the perception of that depends on the predisposition of the observers. And so maybe in journalism, you might say, if people believed that a journalist who was trying to meet a deadline and put together a good story based on, complex facts meant well, and they didn't get it quite right, there's a different reaction than if they don't get it quite right and they don't believe that they meant well. So I'm going to come back to that later, because I want to understand if maybe you have a theory about the people don't trust that they mean well. And this applies in all areas of society, where if you have a disposition towards someone that they're probably doing their best and they mean well, you hear that phrase a lot, their heart was in the right place. Then when things go wrong, it's a very different reaction, typically. So I'm going to want to come back to that, and because that might have an application on the corporate side. But Jack, you have the hardest job for this last question, because I'm tagging on the follow-up after you say your observation about declines in trust. What does this have to do with public corporations? Like, where is this connection to public corporations? And I know you'll nail it, but I'll let Anne chime in as well. I know she has a very thoughtful way of explaining that. But Jack, maybe you go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. And I just noticed your sock puppet in the background. That's pretty cool. I think this is a fascinating topic, because I actually think Marianne hit it right on the nose, that we know so much more, and sometimes that makes us know less. And I think what that's done is it's created an environment that's incredibly divisive out there, where people just question things, probably more than they actually should, but sometimes probably for good reason. And I think, that creates a lack of trust, and a lack of trust creates confusion. And I think that's exacerbated by some of these corporations, which is my world, frankly, ask for it. They do things that, where they try to pawn off responsibility to other people. And I just really feel like that's the wrong approach. And I guess, I'm on a lot of audit committees, as you might guess. And one of the things we really focus on when you're looking at like SOX controls, probably the number one thing I focus on is tone at the top. And I think that a lot of this just really gets down to tone at the top within corporations. The tone at the top has to start in the right place. And if it does, then you're going to create the right values and the right approach to running your business that's not just about maximizing profit. And don't get me wrong, as many people who have worked with me know, I'm really fond of maximizing profit. But it's really about building a corporation that makes a difference. And I think that what we need to do as corporations, because there are a lot of good corporations out there, we need to be more transparent about what we're doing, right? We need to actually hold ourselves accountable, and we need to tell you what we're doing, right? And I think that that's where all this attention on trust will actually create a greater good in the long run, is that it's going to force a lot of these corporations to either say that they are for the greater good, or maybe they're not, right? And if they're not, let's let the market take care of them.
Fantastic. That's a good segue to our poll. We have a couple polls. We'll do the first one, which is I'd love to have the participants' sense of their level of trust around institutions and its trend over the last little while. So if everyone's willing to jump in and just answer this quick poll, it's over the last 10 years for the established institutions, larger corporations, higher education institutions, political bodies, et cetera, has your level of trust, then you get to pick. Increase, stayed the same, decline significantly. No opinion. You're entitled to have no opinion. So we'll give everyone a second, and Nancy will close the poll in a moment once we've gotten most people to answer, and then we'll see what the answer was. And then we'll kind of move ahead. All right. Okay, so the majority has seen their trust decline, and almost a third more has had it's declined significantly. So that's, well, it's in keeping with the trends we know, it's in keeping with the polls that we issue, so that's no surprise. But maybe let me ask then a couple of issues about trust and the things specifically that have eroded it that are observable, maybe particularly in Silicon Valley or to the corporations in Silicon Valley. So we got hints from Anne and Marianne. Deepa, can I turn to you and ask you what you think one of the more impactful mechanisms of erosion of trust has been? If you think, I think I'm asking a question about technology and the rise of modern technology, but feel free to kind of explore that however you like.
I think, well, one factor, I don't know if this is one of the most powerful factors, but one factor has been sort of the delta between what the tech companies out here say they are versus what they wind up becoming. These are businesses. They do like to maximize profit. But they have positioned themselves as sort of, I think in Facebook's S1, it says, this wasn't started to be a company. Google's don't be evil. There's a bunch of examples like that where you have these institutions that are incredibly rich and incredibly powerful, but they position themselves as sort of champions of the little guy. And I think over time, from reporting, you start to see areas where, they have exercised power. I think some people might say abused power. It's sort of in the eye of the beholder, but you see these scenarios where they've exercised power in a way that might hurt people or communities. I'm thinking of Amazon and the way that they treat their workers. There's been a lot of reporting around that. And so I think that there is that as that gap widens, as people start to realize there's a huge difference between the message and the reality, that has contributed to a deterioration of trust in tech companies, especially over the last few years. That's one factor, I think. I think another factor is the fact that they are impossible to escape. There aren't a lot of alternatives. So if you don't have a fallback option and suddenly you realize this is the main option, I think that people use Facebook all the time, even though trust in Facebook has fallen, because it's simply the only way. And that doesn't necessarily, if you have no other options, you're not necessarily embracing and choosing Facebook. It can create kind of a tension or a resentment that, you have to use this platform. And I think that also kind of contributes to lack of trust.
Got it.
Well,
no, that's great. So you have this kind of expectations gap, right? Which is sometimes of their own making in terms of here's what we mean to do, the image, and then what really happens. You have a sort of practical power impact. Any large, powerful competitive entity is going to end up being disruptive. Sometimes groups will lose, but others will benefit. And sometimes, thankfully, generally the pie is bigger, but it might be redistributed in a way that isn't either fitting with the image or made people feel bad or both.
Right.
And then finally, you have this issue of a lot of rhetoric. It's different from the image, a lot of rhetoric about engagement and improving the community and trying to make things better. And that's going to make me turn to Anne and ask you maybe the broader question of what is the corporate role from your viewpoint in fostering the common good, and not even just the role, maybe the obligation, the level of obligation. Then we're going to tease that out because, again, we're largely an audience of corporate directors or corporate executives. And I think there is a very healthy, I hope, debate about what is the role and then obligation. So Anne, I'd love you to kick that part off. What do you
Sure.
think?
I'm going to go back and draw on a paper that a couple of business ethicists at the University of Pennsylvania published as they were retiring in 2015. And they posed this really interesting kind of query to a bunch of people. It was law is to justice as medicine is to health, as business is to blank. And they asked people to fill in that blank. And they went around and did their study and came back with this this phrase that only an academic could love: optimized collective value. Business is optimized collective value. But when you really dig into what they're talking about there, they actually are talking about trust and the common good. They are talking about human welfare and advancing, progress for all. So we know inequality erodes trust, and that's, I think, been a significant societal factor over the last couple of decades. But we can also see that business has a real function, if you buy into the end of this equation that these two scholars came to, in helping us all to optimize collective value, to take the resources that we all share in this world together and use them for our best advantage. And that's a function of commerce. That's what business does for us.
Great. I'm going to then break this into parts and ask questions of all the panelists around this. I think that's a really good foundation. But before we do it, I want to do another quick poll just to get the sense of the participants again on this kind of broad idea of what are the obligations and roles. So this one says, what role do you think publicly traded, so very specific, publicly traded for-profit corporations should play in addressing social issues like inequality, racial justice, and or climate change? These are just examples, but they're pretty prominent ones. There are many nuanced choices, but we're gonna give you three with some parentheticals. One, little or none, just about stakeholders making money, shareholders. And the second one is some role, since they're part of the social fabric. And then the third is direct responsibility. They're only as good as the community they serve. And then perhaps we're invoking this idea of the optimized total social good. So take a moment, make your pick. Again, it's for the publicly traded for-profit corporations. And we'll see what people say out of curiosity. I'm very interested. Okay. So only a few thought the little or none. So that's the shareholder narrow interpretive supremacy theory, which we can get to if we want. Most, nearly half, some role, and then many, like a close second, direct responsibility. That's interesting, which is closer to what Ann said. All right, well, that's really good to know. All right, so here's the maybe follow up, and anyone who wants to jump in can do that. And that is, how far does this corporate obligation extend as a practical matter and as an expectations matter? I mean, what does it look like? You can give an example of where, a corporation did not do maybe what it should have done, or where one really did it really well. Maybe give us an example, or just kind of your opinion. How far does this obligation extend? And I can subdivide that if you like, but maybe anyone who wants to go next is better.
I would be willing to start, and just for the members who entered in the poll that they think that corporations have a large responsibility. For me, it connects back to corporation is not something that is intangible. A corporation is really people, and it is a member of a community. And if we think about community as a web and not as disconnected or isolated segments of society, but rather that there's this interdependence and interconnectedness that exists, then it's a strong argument for why corporations would have a big role. I also think that, it has a big role because it is about the employees, but also those who interact with the system, as well as how we're preparing young people to engage in that corporate work or in that industry in their future work life. So I can see over this continuum of time in multiple years of the life of a corporation, that those investments in social justice, those investments in community advocacy around shared values and with a bent towards ethics and ethical decision making are positive reinforcements of trust of all of the systems that interact with that corporation.
Thanks, Marianne. I think that's a good jumping off point for some other comments. One thing I would like to maybe have someone address is This idea of ethics is a good, grounding. I don't think anyone I've ever met would say we shouldn't make sure, young people don't walk away with a better understanding of ethical behavior so they can implement it. But then if you move into the corporate space, it gets trickier in some ways, right? So you have kind of moral imperatives, you have ethical obligations, you have legal obligations, and those are not always the same. And I would actually argue that the legal obligations are a much lower bar. They tend to be, don't do bad things. And if you do, tell us, right? So way lower bar. So I wonder if someone could comment on that. Like if I'm a board member and I'm confronted with these choices and this kind of moral imperative that I think we've made a good case for, and yet my legal obligations include things like, fiduciary duties to my shareholders to maximize profit. Like, someone reconcile that for me, or maybe don't reconcile it and just give us the tension so we can think about it correctly.
I'll give you a couple of kind of extremes, I'll call them. So let's just deal with the obvious ones. You're on the board of Purdue Pharmaceutical. Okay, what happened there should have never happened, and it was a series of events that really pushed them, really probably very earnings based. But if I, for example, was the CFO and I saw the sales incentives programs that were being put in place at that company, I would have had to do something to stop that, right? Because the incentives were misaligned with what's good for society and, frankly, what's good for the corporation in the long run, right? Purdue didn't win in the long run; they lost, right? So I think that there's this step back that companies need to do and just say, it's deep. It's the old Wall Street Journal test. Do I want this written on the front page of the Wall Street Journal? I mean, it's just a logic check that sometimes is missing in these companies. But I want to give you an example of someone who did the right thing, and I have to be careful here because I don't want to disclose the company. But there is a large, well-known company in the Valley that has a product that's used by most businesses. And they had the opportunity to create a sub-product that was based on the same data that they could have sold for, frankly, a lot of money to folks that could have used the data in a really bad way. And I was speaking with the CFO when I actually brought it up to him at one point. I said, hey, have you guys ever thought about going down this path? He said, yeah, we looked at it. We decided that the risk of going down that path and the exposure of going down that path made it not worth going down that path. So these things actually do get discussed in corporations, is what I'm trying to say. And this gets to a point I wanted to make before about the press. And don't take it the wrong way, Deepa, but we all talk too much about the negatives, right? The negatives get all the stories. I don't see people coming in and doing pieces about the good things that corporations are doing, right? And look, there's a lot of bad corporations that have done a lot of bad things, but there's a lot of good corporations that are pretty active within their communities, that try to do things to make society better, really have the right values. And I think we need to elevate those discussions too, so that we can, frankly, reestablish some of the trust that needs to be out there.
And Jack, I'm going to come back, but I'm giving you a warning ahead of time to maybe give us more clear examples about corporate behavior in the form of corporate transparency and some of the things. But I want to see if anyone else wants to weigh in on this specific kind of divergence of legal obligation, moral obligation, ethics before I kind of move on to that. Deepa or Ann, did you guys want to throw in anything? You don't feel obligated, but.
I was just going to say, there is enlightened self-interest, right? So if you're running a corporation, you want people to be able to make business decisions quickly and to uphold the corporate value, as Jack talked about, the fact that you're not eroding it. You don't want to be a WeWork or an Uber where you can actually see millions and billions of dollars erode because of a lack of trust or ethical decision making. And we know that these younger generations that are in the workplace right now, and also our consumers, are looking to companies and expecting them to use values to make decisions and to be clear, transparent, to share what are those values that are being used. It's an extraordinary number of people expect now CEOs to speak out on social issues. So there's really kind of a hunger for that kind of leadership coming in the corporation, but it also serves the corporation's interests, because when there's a unity of purpose and a common set of values, people can come to the kinds of decisions that Jack just described much more quickly and cleanly, and they can move on. And that serves most organizations well.
So we've got a couple of questions accumulated, which is great. I'm going to ask maybe 2 or so more questions, then we'll kind of pivot to questions from the audience, and I'll wrap up one of them. I wanted to add an item to Jack's Wall Street Journal front page test, which is another more practical one. I actually do have an Uncle Bob, and he was once superintendent of public instruction in Iowa. He's in his late 80s now, and it became what I refer to as the Uncle Bob litmus test, which was he's a sophisticated, well-read, well-educated guy, but he really isn't up for all the kind of weird power play shenanigans that often or sometimes characterize Silicon Valley firms. And so not only Wall Street Journal page, but you say something like, well, this person worked very hard and they really needed the private jet. And so we kind of did them the loan, and and he'll be like, what, back up, tell me that again. And kind of the Uncle Bob test, which is the reasonable person test, no matter how logical or how appropriately appointed, the reasonable person, what do they say, and how do they react, and what do they think is fair or just right? And that was often his comment. And again, sophisticated guy, but he would say, that just doesn't seem right. Like that and it resonates. So maybe my follow-up question around certain issues of inequality and other items, we got some follow-ups on that. What role should corporations be playing in that regard? Like, I think we observed that inequality can give rise to more distrust, and the logic of that is pretty straightforward, I think, in a lot of places. If someone who thinks of themselves as a little above average works pretty hard and looks to their left and looks to their right and sees that other people are doing 10 times better or 100 times better or 1,000 times better, it's very hard to reconcile that with like your behavior. You can't be 1/1000th as good or as hardworking as someone. That seems almost impossible. So like fundamentally it creates all sorts of trust issues. But on the other hand, Silicon Valley is fantastically successful, right? We have rewarded people richly for doing amazing things. And it feels like that's a tricky balance. So what could boards or corporate players do to reconcile this inequality issue if we really think it matters, especially in the context of high-performing companies? It seems a very difficult challenge. Any ideas or thoughts or observations? Deepa, that was a knowing sigh. You should unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
No, I guess I don't know to the extent to which this doesn't really directly answer your question, but I think there's only so much a company can really do. I think it's about strengthening, and just to reiterate the point I made earlier, it's about strengthening the institutions around it, and for people to feel like, okay, like if this is what a company does, they maximize profit, they try to give, they supply jobs, but then they're also being held to account by the press, they're also being held to account by government. And regulators and all the different things. It's about the web of institutions, it's not the one institution itself. And at a time like now, you think about inequality. I mean, Facebook has had, I spent a lot of time writing about Facebook, and they've had one controversy after the other for a long time. It's been 4.5 years since the 2016 election, but even before, right? It was just one controversy after the other, and it's what is it, like a $500 billion company, and it's still like there's the gap between the public trust in that company and their earnings is extraordinary, and I can't blame somebody who looks at that, says, well, those guys keep screwing up, and here's Congress debating whether or not to send me a $1,400 check. Like how that kind of a reward for a company who in the market for a company that has had so many public problems, I think that is that contributes to this lack of trust. And so what you've got is, well, the market isn't really holding Facebook accountable for societal issues, or at least it's easy to feel that way, right? I know that maybe Jack would say that their value would be much higher if they had a problem, but it still doesn't really address the fact that at the base level, people are struggling and like living hand to mouth, whereas they see these other companies that aren't doing so well just have fabulous wealth. And so it's hard to know as your Uncle Bob or my Uncle Raju, like what exactly is the right, it's hard to understand like how these things are all possible. And that to me speaks to the fabric of society and the web of institutions and the way that they're all interconnected and hold each other in check. That's crumbling a little bit, and we need to find ways to strengthen it.
Jack, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a good example of where the markets are actually, I think, becoming efficient. What you're seeing is we're having this discussion today. Okay, this discussion would have never been had 4 or 5 years ago. Now we can argue that maybe we're having the discussion because things are a lot worse than they were 4 or 5 years ago. But I would actually say that there's more visibility to what's going on. I see it all the time in that, buy-side funds are, you just look at Larry Fink and his letter every year and the attention that it gets. And look, corporations listen to that stuff. We have many conversations in boardrooms about social responsibility, about environment. All these things are becoming real issues. It gets even more efficient. You're starting to see ESG-focused funds that are investing specifically in the right companies. So the markets will have a way of making this more efficient, is my guess, and rewarding the companies that actually do go back and work with, Marianne's schools or other organizations that are important to the communities around us. And I think it's really good to see.
In fact, Jack, let me ask, I'm going to weave in 2 or 3 of the questions we've received into this question, something you and I have talked about. So what do you think are the best practices around corporate formalities in this regard? So for example, we have one question that says, it's all fine and well to kind of say tone at the top, but should you be incorporating this attention to social good and the like into the charter? Should you put it formally in a statement? Should the corporation be clear and obligate itself as opposed to hoping that you have the right tone at the top? And simultaneously, what are the signs of a company that is performing at the top of this effort to be transparent and engage in the right behaviors? And then I'm going to come back to how often maybe the best practices for boards to talk about this. But Jack, I know you have opinions on at least 1 or 2 of those points. I wonder if you could kind of throw those out, and then we can have Anne weigh in as well. I know she talks to corporations all the time about that.
Yeah, sure. From a structural standpoint, you can put things like PBCs together or B Corps. There's structures out there that legally will make a corporation kind of accountable in certain ways and shapes and forms. I'm not as big of a fan of that, quite honestly. I think I don't need those kind of rules to do the right thing. And I think that corporations are all relatively different, and they are going to have, some people are going to care more about certain things than other things. And I think that you've got to do it within a company. But most importantly, I think you need transparency and you need accountability. And that's really what hasn't happened until it's just starting to happen now. An example I'll give you is this year where public corporations are obligated to put in human capital disclosures in some of their documents. One of my companies actually just filed their 10K yesterday, Silicon Labs down in Austin. And I was really proud when I read their section about human capital, about corporate social responsibility. They've basically put out there what this company stands for. And they put it not just in the proxy, they put it in the 10K, the most read document that an investor would look at. And so someone is going to hold this company accountable for what they're saying. Now, I will tell you, I think it's relatively broad what they're saying right now, but it's going to get more and more specific. And I can also tell you that behind the scenes, they're getting, bonuses are getting tied to things like diversity within the company, right? And you're starting to see that kind of bubble up within corporations. And I think that's really where the boards need to kind of step in and actually say, hey guys, what do we really stand for? And how are we going to hold ourselves accountable for that?
So this idea of public facing filed specific disclosures, which in turn tie to or arguably link to performance incentives and the like. I would agree that's a very new evolution. It's popped up now and again, but it feels like a trend. And can you add to that a little bit, including maybe aspirational best practices for corporations and how boards can get there if they're not there yet? Like how do you foster that in the boardroom?
Sure. I like this example that Jack's given. It's this idea of a statement of the interests that you're serving the audiences and getting just articulating them so that investors and customers can understand how decisions are being made. There really are a set of best practices around culture management for ethics that are more like a hard technical skill than the way I think a lot of people, when they hear the word culture, tend to say, oh, that's kind of touchy-feely, airy-fairy. We can't really get our arms around that. But in fact, there are things companies can do. So the best practices that we see are some form of self-assessment, some ability, some desire to take the temperature in the organization and start to create some benchmarks around values and purpose and the ways that business are conducted. We know that organizations that use a mix of cultural elements, in other words, they don't over rely on just the catchy phrases that are very common in Silicon Valley, the, move fast and break things and do no evil. But if that's all you've got, if you haven't rounded out the other ways that you can really bring culture to life in an organization, then you get yourself into trouble. And our research supports that. You can look for conditions. You can, and as a board member, you can try and encourage the development of conditions like this connection, this responsibility to society, a climate of trust in the organization that really starts with individual agency and control over work. And the way decisions are made. Do you have a process of ethical deliberation? Do you share the rationale for decisions when they're made whenever possible? There's certain characteristics that you can look for. So yeah, we work with companies all the time to try and help them figure out how to operationalize that in their organizations.
That's great. I'm going to ask a similar question to Marianne, but maybe have you draw from your world about some best practices. Full disclosure, both my parents at different times were teachers, and for 1 year in the middle of graduate school, I took a year off to do some other stuff. I was a full-time substitute teacher. So like I appreciate how difficult teaching is, and it has some features, right? Which is if you do twice as well, you don't get paid twice as much. Whereas sometimes Silicon Valley, if you do 3 times as well, you get paid 8 times as much. And then there's also the idea that you really have to serve everybody. You can't pick your customer. You have to serve everybody. And in a way, there's, as you know, legal special obligations to make sure you effectively serve everybody. And so it's a really, really tough environment. And yet, as you pointed out, there is a remarkable level of trust, relatively speaking, in communities and their public schools. And so are there lessons that you think can be drawn from your world and applied in the corporate environment that, could be successful?
There are a couple that come to mind right away, and it may extend back to what Jack was saying earlier about storytelling, and perhaps where do we rely on information and who tells our story. And I think one of the things that local schools and local school districts can do, and that many do well, is in relationship with community and with their parents and staff, tell the story of the work of the school and the needs of the students in their community and the investments that they're making to address those needs, and that there's buy-in and participation of community that brings voice. And I think there's also this idea, and I just want to lift it up for corporations as well. And we do a lot in schools around, team spirit and, belonging, a sense of belonging and inclusiveness. And it just makes me wonder, in terms of our corporation work and ethics, to what degree do we value brand loyalty or employee loyalty over perhaps a sense of pride of belonging to something or contributing to something? And then similarly, you alluded to the differentials around wages, and that also makes me wonder in terms of, how do we value different types of work and the contributions of that work to achieving the ultimate goals of the community or the corporation or the school.
Thanks. We have a hodgepodge of different questions, so I'm just going to kind of pick and choose through the questions and try to synthesize them a little bit. So one theme that we've had is, the naming of special roles within organizations. So we have a question that goes something like, there's a trend in naming chief ethics officers, and what do we think about that? And there's also an earlier question that highlights issues around data as applied to machine learning and artificial intelligence, but the responsibilities that the company might have. And my add-on to that will be, what should boards be thinking about and doing to appropriately embrace their ethical moral obligations in the context of things like data acquisition, data deployment, machine learning. As we know, it's rife with wonderful possibilities, but also really serious downfalls. So maybe address the creation of special roles, ethics officer, otherwise, and the things that boards should be doing affirmatively to get ahead of the problem that hasn't arrived yet. I'm happy to have anyone jump in on that. Anne, you want to go first?
Sure. We are seeing more companies carve out ethics as a standalone entity. For many years, ethics and compliance were together, and to some degree, we would say we won the battle but lost the war, in the sense that ethics kind of got swallowed up by compliance. And a culture of compliance is really much more about checking boxes and, oh, what are we going to do if something does go wrong? Ethics at its core is about human flourishing. It's about creating the conditions in which we all do our best. And so when organizations can get in that kind of positive mindset and invest in and paint a picture for the people in their organization of what it is they're shooting for and how that's making a positive contribution, they have more success. And so that's what we're starting to see through some partnerships we have with the World Economic Forum and the companies that participate in it. We get to talk to chief people that are working in offices of ethical and humane use of technology, or in an ethics and society division. Those are new things that are emerging, and we of course consider them to be positive developments, because it does put the energy and the emphasis on this very forward-looking positive outcome that you're shooting for.
And in all things corporate governance, of course, no one size fits all. And so maybe the follow-up to the same question, if Jack, if you're willing to weigh in, you're involved in companies at very early stages and in later stages, and they are moving really fast, kind of by definition. Is there a strategy that you've seen to successfully, create attention to and accountability on these issues that is different maybe from naming a chief ethics officer? If a lot of these companies post Series B, you don't have enough money to hire a general counsel, much less a head of HR or a chief ethics officer. So, but you can't ignore this. So any suggestions or observations about things that have worked?
It's interesting. So I think a lot of this gets back to the tone at the top. So, one of the things that investors will tell you is that they invest in people, right? And it sounds very cliche, but it's actually quite true. I can tell you in my approach with private companies, I tend to not join private boards until I've gotten to know the CEOs for an extended period of time. I use what I call my free consulting period, and it's really meant to protect everybody, them and me. I recently had an interesting situation with a company where they were asking if I would be interested in getting on the board, and I turned it back around on them and had a discussion about the number of women that they had on their board, which was a sum total of 0. And I said, forget that that's not probably right. What are your employees telling you? And actually, ironically, this CEO had actually heard from his employees that they did not like the fact that they had a bunch of men on their board. I said, so why would you ask me to join if you can't fix that problem? And so I helped him fix that problem. And what that told me is, it's progress, because when the employees actually speak out, right, that's a huge step that really, I think, creates a structural change within these corporations. And I think that's going to roll through the next 5-10 years, where corporations are actually going to change. This ESG trend is not going away, right? And even if you're a small company, you're going to have to be aware of this. You're not going to have a chief ethics officer, and you shouldn't, but everybody should be the chief ethics officer, right? And you need to take that responsibility and run with it as a management team.
So I have one small thing to add to that. A lot of companies do that kind of thing for PR reasons, to get positive stories on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, I guess. It's a matter of how much power does that person have? Who do they report to? What's their mandate? What are the goals? And a lot of times these companies don't think through that, and they just sort of say, oh, we'll figure it out on the fly. And that's not a confidence booster. So that's just a
Well,
point I'd
this
add.
raises I'm going to pull up our next poll question. This raises a set of questions around authenticity and, you know, how people read the behavior of both the company and the board and others. And I would say my older kids are like heat-seeking missiles for inauthentic corporate behavior. Like it provokes, at least from my perspective, I don't like inauthenticity more than anyone else, but for them, like they'll rampage on it. They'll share, you know, don't buy here, don't do that. And when it is authentic, and so far as I can tell, they're pretty good at sussing out the two differences. It really resonates. So they're like 17 and 19, right? So they're kind of, you know, Gen Z and young. So I want to come back to that. But a lot of that is driven by, I will say, social media, right? So their impressions of this come across on social media. And a lot of times the positive campaigns, Deepa, that you're describing, are on social media, and they have exactly the opposite effect on my kids. And then I always dig a little deeper. I'm like, oh, you're so cynical, you're so suspicious. I dig a little deeper. I'm like, yeah, that's greenwashing. You're absolutely right. Here's a thing called a 10K. I can show you where it's not matching up. So it's really interesting to me. So let's do this poll about transparency and whose fault is it? It's kind of a mishmash. By the way, these are meant as kind of thought experiments. We got a couple of comments saying, oh, these aren't mutually exclusive. Absolutely right. These are not to be taken as perfectly well-designed polls. It's meant to nudge us into thinking a little bit more. So has there been a decline in transparency along with increase in misinformation? If so, like whose fault is it? And that's probably an unfair question, and it's certainly not nuanced enough, but let's take a stab at it. Maybe, you know, we should have said, whose fault is it the most of, or some permutation of poor grammar like that. So take a moment, see what you get. I worry we're gonna get a lot of a mix of the aboves, which kind of doesn't help me make my point, but that's okay. We'll see what we get. All right, how do we do? Yeah, all right, so see, we're all thoughtful people on this. You know, 0 for lawyers, that's a good day. I'm gonna take that one home. Yay, that hardly ever happens. You ask any question about blame and lawyers normally end up on the poll. Okay, so it's a mix of the above. We've got modern technology, social media, leaders of institutions, and 1 out of 10 folks not thinking there's been a decline. So let's again, pulling a little bit from some of the questions that have been asked about, you know, news coverage and the like, let's talk about authenticity. How important do you think, quote unquote, corporate transparency that is authentic is, and what are some do's and don'ts in your opinion about, you know, manifesting an authentic approach to these issues that we've identified? Any examples or thoughts?
I can give you, I have a company that's pretty focused on this. And by the way, if I could redo the poll, I'd vote for lawyers there for you, Dan. So I'm on the board of a company called Threadup, and Threadup is the largest online marketplace for secondhand clothing. So you can imagine the mission of the company is basically environmental in many ways. And so we are actually very clear within the company, not to toot our horn, but the company's very clear about, you know, the impact that it makes when it operates, right? You know, if you think about one of the single biggest forms of waste, it's clothing, right? Particularly in the last 5-10 years with the onslaught of fast clothing, you know, the Forever 21s and all that kind of stuff. And so, you know, there's a real mission to what this company is doing. So from day one, it's actually been a really big deal within the company, because that's really the shareholders are within the company, to be transparent. And it's quite interesting to watch now, because I guess I could say this, but they're on file confidentially to go public. And so you have to change some of that approach when you go public, right? Because, you know, some stuff you can talk about and stuff you can't talk about. So there's a cultural shift that will happen. But when they do go public, they'll be talking about a lot of these metrics, and it becomes key aspects of how they run the company, right? And they will hold themselves accountable to it. And they will actually show people the impact that they're having, and it attracts your kids, right? You know, if you look at who does thrifting or who does secondhand clothing, it's really the millennials, the Gen Zs that are really doing it. So I think that there's ample opportunity to do this stuff, but again, everything gets back to transparency to me, right? You know, you have to actually honestly talk to your shareholders, to your society, in ways in which you're holding yourself accountable over the long haul.
Any last thought on that before I do our wrap-up question, Anne?
I was just saying, authenticity is really a hot topic right now, and in CEOs, in C-suites, and boardrooms. And the analogy that I've heard used is, when you've got a sailboat and you've got good wind, and you're sailing along, everything's going great, but occasionally the wind dies, and then you have to switch on the motor, and it's not as easy. It's a lot more work and not as enjoyable. So I think back to that management of culture. For me, it all comes back to culture, and transparency is part of that. And so you want to, intentionally drive your culture so that it's feeling like sailing for people in the organization. It's clear to them what the purpose is and how to get there. And it does feel authentic. And I think increasingly we're seeing leaders who are investing a whole lot more in understanding how to translate that inside their organizations.
That's great. Invoking my Uncle Bob, which my kids also know, obviously, he would often say, well, don't just listen to what they say, just watch what they do and track that, right? And the doing matters often, to your point, Jack and Ann. So here's our wrap-up question. First, I want to acknowledge that we got a lot of really great questions. I know that we'll distribute those among the panelists in case someone wants to opt in and answer them. I also want to highlight the fact that we got a handful of great questions about what is the public good? When you get to the details, reasonable people disagree. It makes it very hard to work it out. You don't have to have unreasonable people. So to have these conflicts, it could be very thoughtful, reasonable people. We have in the near future, and we're probably going to rope you into this, the thoughts around a webinar that focuses on the tactics of what is the right thing to do in that context, and what's gray, what's black, what's white, if there is any. So we didn't want to have people think we're ignoring that completely, but it's a whole webinar to itself. So the final question, and Deepa, heads up, I think I'm going to have you go first. Is there anything that you think someone who's listening to this webinar who plays a role in the corporate world could do differently, that you would urge them to do differently, like right away, that you think improves this entire question? And that'll be the same question for everybody.
Okay. So I think just be mindful of that gap between what you say you're about versus what you actually are. I mean, I think that, reporters have become more and more skeptical, which is actually, in my opinion, appropriate, of sort of mission statements, of kind of platitudes, whatever, because it's watch what people do, like Bob says, as opposed to what they say. And I think just be mindful of the fact that there are just a lot of people that aren't really gonna buy your BS, and you shouldn't expect them to, and that is going to take a lot of work. I mean, there has been a loss of trust, and it's going to take 10 times more work to recover that. And so I think that would be, I think that's the reality.
That's great. Thanks, Marianne. I'll have you go next.
I think there are many kind of next steps if it's important to the CEO and important to the board. Some steps around ethics training for all staff, ethics training for the board, ways in which to diversify the board are some great next steps as well. And I would just also say that when we want to consider ethics for the individual corporation and how we build trust, that at this point in time in our history with the pandemic, we also need to consider how what we do contributes to trust in community and trust in our systems and our government, because quite literally our health and safety are top of mind for everyone right now. And so I think things around hiring processes, participating in local government, participating in ways in which we give everyone some access to conversations about ethics and the common good.
Fantastic. Jack, I have you next for 30 seconds, then Ann, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward for me. It's about transparency, accountability, and action, right? So I think if you can pull off of those things, I think we can hopefully reverse or at least turn back some of the distrust that I hear in Deepa's voice, which is warranted in many ways. So it's not good enough to just disclose this stuff. You need to track it. You need to motivate people on it. You need to compensate people on it, right? There has to be definable actions that people can act on. If we do that, people who are either in management or on boards, if we do that, I think we can make a big difference.
Fantastic. Anne, last word.
I think leaders in all parts of society need to use facts and empathy to lead. I think we need to use more partnerships between organizations across sectors to kind of try and restore trust. And I agree with both Deepa and Jack about mission statements and transparency. We work with companies to have them understand, are you actually using your mission statement to make any decisions? And if you're not, it's not your mission, or it's not a useful mission for what you're trying to do. So we're back to that same authenticity that the businesses, have to embrace their mandate. They have to act on it first and then communicate about it.
Well, we're out of time, so I want to thank you all very much for such a great panel. Deepa, Jack, Anne, and Marianne. Really appreciate your time and very much appreciate the time that people spent with us today. It was really great, and this will be available on our website and other events. You can go to svdx.org and both see previous webinars and this one soon enough, and then the upcoming event. So thank you very much, everyone. We appreciate it very much.